Hi everyone, welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're just letting folks join. In the meantime, you can just hang tight, but we'll get started in just a second. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hey everyone, if you just joined, just waiting just a minute to allow folks to settle in. You're not missing anything just yet. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for NOAA's Climate and Societal Interactions Nature-Based Solutions webinar series, third episode, Building Coastal Adaptive Capacity Through Nature-Based Solutions. My name is Aaliyah Mejias, and I'm a Canals Fellow with the Climate Adaptation Partnerships Program. Next slide, please. And before we begin, we'll have some quick housekeeping notes. If you can hear me and see the presentation, you are good to go. We're excited to have live Spanish interpretation available today. And to enable hearing Spanish audio, you can click on the headphones icon and select Spanish. To go back to hearing the English audio, you will need to select none. And there's a second headphones icon once you click on that, the bottom one. Unfortunately, we are not able to provide folks with to help them troubleshoot any technical issues. We recommend rejoining the session if you have any trouble connecting. If you have any questions for the speakers, please submit them using the question function. And then finally, this is being recorded, so you will receive a recording after the presentation concludes to all registrants, and it will also be posted on our website. So we'll be providing quick overviews of our webinar series and the NOAA programs that fund each of these featured works. And then the bulk of the time will be dedicated to our presenters to share their funded projects. And we'll have about 10 minutes for your questions. Next slide. This 5-part webinar series features projects funded by the Climate and Societal Interactions Division, or CSI, focused on the research and equitable application of nature-based solutions, which are actions to protect, sustainably manage, or restore natural or modified ecosystems to address societal challenges, simultaneously providing benefits for people and the environment. Each webinar episode will feature different projects to demonstrate the diverse contributions CSI has to the body of nature-based solutions, research, and practice of implementation, and provide time for the audience to ask the presenters questions. Each webinar has a different focus, so we hope you'll join us each month, but we're really excited to have so many registrants with us today, representing a variety of sectors. With that, let's shift to my colleague, Jeannie Bay, to learn more about NOAA, CSI, and the Climate Adaptation Program. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have such a wide attendance for the third episode of our webinar series. My name is Jeannie Bay, and I'm a program specialist supporting the CAP program. I wanted to start off by first providing some situational awareness of where the CSI division sits within NOAA. So NOAA is within the Department of Commerce, and the NOAA Climate Program Office is hosted under the Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Line Office, or OAR. Next slide, please. So the Climate and Societal Interactions Division within CPO supports research that seeks to generate the knowledge, tools, and institutional networks that enhance society's capacity to anticipate, plan for, and adapt to climate impacts. Our focus complements the work of the physical science research and development portfolio across NOAA by using insights from social science research to interpret, synthesize, and apply climate data analysis and observations. Programmatically, this is what CSI looks like today. It is a science policy, research, and engagement enterprise that brings to NOAA an emphasis on individuals and communities and the ongoing decisions involved in the process of adapting to climate change, both here and abroad. CSI is home to two unique programs, the Climate Adaptation Partnerships Program, or CAP, which was formerly known as RISA, and then the Adaptation Sciences Program, what we call ADSI. Next slide, please. So the mission of the CAP program is to advance equitable adaptation through sustained regional research and community engagement. We accomplish this by supporting a network of regional teams through competitively awarded 5-year cooperative agreements in multi-state regions across the United States. Teams are composed of experts and local partners working across a diverse range of sectors and with urban and rural communities and local, state, and tribal governments on their cross-sectoral climate adaptation needs. In recent years, the network has begun focusing more directly on equity and tackling the complex compound stressors, both climate and socioeconomic, faced by communities, and has also focused more attention on partnering with frontline communities. So on the right of this slide here is our ring graphic, which depicts the CAP process. It is within these actions and outcomes that novel climate solutions are developed. The CAP program represents a long-term investment toward this mission, as the program is over 25 years old, and our vision is to continue investing in regions and expanding into areas that are not yet covered by the program for the long haul. Next slide, please. So here is a map of our current CAP network of regional teams. The 13 CAP teams that make up the network are depicted in solid colors. These teams have been working in their regions, some over many years, to build relationships and produce collaborative research and community-relevant adaptation approaches. We're working hard to reach full national coverage, but that is largely dependent on congressional appropriations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned prior, CAP teams determine the research they engage in alongside the communities that they serve, taking into account the unique environmental, socioeconomic, and cultural variables of their regions. CAP approaches nature-based solutions work by applying this programmatic lens of integrating social and natural physical sciences and considering complex compounding hazards and benefits. This holistic lens allows for challenging more conventional approaches to nature-based solutions that may be solely focused on engineering and design, and rather emphasizes the importance of considering societal and community-level variables. Significantly, CAP's work spans both coastal and inland communities, making our investments in nature-based solutions distinct from many other NBS-focused programs at NOAA that are more concentrated in coastal zones. And nature-based solutions work funded through CAP can be loosely categorized into these buckets here, which include informing decision support and community planning, identifying trade-offs and co-benefits, advancing equity in workforce development, as well as analysis and evaluation of projects once implemented. More specifically, CAP has funded work on developing community-wide green infrastructure master plans, examining the intersection of extreme heat, human health, and nature-based solutions, and transforming vacant, neglected, and underutilized land into a matrix of green infrastructure, just to name a few projects. So during this series, you'll hear from some of the researchers themselves who helped carry out projects like these. From here, I will turn things over to my colleague, Bhaskar, from CAP's sister program, Adaptation Sciences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. My name is Bhaskar, just like NASCAR. I co-manage a research program called Adaptation Sciences, or ADSI for short. As was mentioned before, the ADSI program is a sister program of CAP and was established in 2021. Three legacy programs, COCA, SARP, and IRAP, were melded together to create the current ADSI program. The goal of the ADSI program is, one, to advance the knowledge, methods, and framework to move society beyond incremental adaptation to a more widespread, connected, and transformative adaptation pathways. The two key objectives of this program are, one, to develop an understanding of key drivers and conditions that shape and enable adaptation, and two, identifying and promoting opportunities for the use of climate information to support preparedness and planned adaptation. Next slide, please. The Adaptation Sciences program prides itself on excelling at blending research, partnership, and engagement. AdSci supports work conducted both within the US by co-leading a partnership with DOT called the Climate Smart Transportation, and outside the US by leveraging the US Department of State funding on projects such as the Island-led Resilience 2030 and the NOAA's Blue Carbon Inventory project. AdSci also provides technical collaboration and capacity building by leveraging funding in areas such as fisheries. The program is called CAFA, and coastal resilience. AdSci encourages and supports research that generates knowledge, tools, and institutional networks to enhance society's ability to anticipate, plan for, and adapt to climate impacts. In short, we take a systems approach and strategically look at compound events and their cascading impacts. We shape and implement our program priorities by participating in various federal work groups and project-specific cross-agency collaboration. A good example in the NBS space is the FEMA guide called Building Community Resilience with NBS, and the Commission for Environmental Cooperation that is between Canada, US, and Mexico on an effort called Monitoring the Efficacy of Nature-Based Solutions, Proposed Methodology and Indicators. NBS is a space that AdSci has invested in the past. Moving forward, we would like to focus more in this space by amplifying our investments in the future by using past work as a springboard. This complements NOAA's broader work in science, service, and stewardship. The program carries out this work by supporting a portfolio of interdisciplinary research and focused partnership. I'll pass it on to Leah.
Thanks, Bhaskar and Jeannie. We're so appreciative of those backgrounds. So increasing communities' capacity to adapt to climate change can take many forms, and today's webinar is going to be focused on coastal adaptation. Our first presentation will be by Sarah Grady, who will share an AdSci-funded project on how communities are working to increase their coastal adaptive capacity and community resilience to sea level rise through workshops and vulnerability assessments that identify potential adaptation pathways, funding opportunities, and data needs. Dr. Sarah Grady is a senior coastal ecologist in the Ecological Restoration Program at Mass Audubon. Her role at Mass Audubon focuses on salt marsh and coastal cranberry bog restoration, coastal resiliency, and providing ecology knowledge for Mass Audubon's monitoring, outreach, and advocacy on the coast. Prior to this position, she spent over 18 years with the Massachusetts Bay National Estuary Partnerships as South Shore Regional Coordinator, a position hosted by the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for being with us today. And as a reminder for participants, you can submit questions you have for Sarah using the question function. Sarah, thanks so much. Take it away.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here today. So a lot of the work that I'm going to be presenting today was conducted by my colleague Danielle Perry, who is now with the NOAA Restoration Center. She worked at Mass Audubon prior to that position. So next slide. So Mass Audubon is guided by an action agenda that has three primary goals. One is to protect and steward resilient landscapes. Two, to advance inclusive and equitable access to nature. And three, to mobilize to fight climate change, because a restored landscape is more resilient, more welcoming, and more prepared for climate change. The Ecological Restoration Program at Mass Audubon is relatively new. It was started in February 2023. Next slide. The objectives of our NOAA grant were to understand the vulnerabilities of Massachusetts salt marshes to climate change by conducting vulnerability assessments in 4 prioritized towns, collect data on disturbances and expected climate change impacts, engage BIPOC students in a paid internship program to help them develop scientific inquiry skills through assisting in data collection and analysis, and then working with those prioritized towns to enhance coastal resilience through workshops. And if you can see the little color-coded dots, each of these objectives does match up with our action agenda goals. Next. So salt marshes along the East Coast and throughout the United States are in decline. Massachusetts has lost 41% of its salt marsh since about 1800. And that is due to multiple impacts, including land use change, altered sediment regimes, and altered nutrient regimes. Here in New England, we have rates of sea level rise that are 3 to 4 times higher than the global average, which means that our salt marsh loss is more imminent and we have to work much faster to try to manage our marshes. Next step. So this project focused on 4 of our Mass Audubon sanctuaries: Rough Meadows in Rowley, Barnstable Great Marsh in Barnstable, Great Neck in Wareham, and Allen's Pond in Dartmouth. Next. Something that is important to point out about Massachusetts is that we have a dramatic difference in tidal ranges and tide height north of Cape Cod versus south of Cape Cod. And so this can affect what salt marsh restoration techniques work best in different parts of the state, as well as which areas are most vulnerable to sea level rise. And so we have to factor that in when we are thinking about how we approach restoration and resilience at each of our coastal sanctuaries. Next. Of the 4 sanctuaries that I mentioned, 2 of them are in the lower tidal range area of the state, Great Neck and Allen's Pond, and 2 of them are in the higher tidal range part of the state, Rough Meadows and Barnstable Great Marsh. And so that means that they will have different vulnerabilities to sea level rise. Those southern marshes tend to be more vulnerable because of where they're positioned in the tidal frame. Our northern marshes tend to have less marsh migration potential because of the slope of the upland and the way that some of the coastal rivers enter our estuaries. And it seems that there's greater intensity of salt marsh ditching and remnants of agricultural impacts in our northern marshes compared to our southern marshes, although all of them have some evidence of agricultural impact through berms and ditching. Next. So this project started with conducting salt marsh vulnerability assessments and giving each marsh a resilience score that was based on nutrient inputs, ponding, plant die-off, ditching, and the presence of invasive species, creating a spectrum of disturbance and resilience. Next. Each marsh was also given a condition score that was based on a survey of the vegetation communities, which resulted in rankings of higher habitat quality or poorer habitat quality. Next. Finally, each marsh was evaluated based on its migration potential, so its ability to move toward the inland as sea level rises. And that's based on surveys of surrounding land use, natural areas where there might be residential areas backing up against the marshes, or where there might be more urbanized areas. And again, this created a ranking based on the space for landward movement or having less space for landward movement. Next. So this created a salt marsh prioritization of those 4 sanctuaries in the 4 towns. Allen's Pond in Dartmouth at the top, then Rough Meadows in the Great Marsh in Rowley, Massachusetts, then Barnstable Great Marsh in Barnstable, and Great Neck in Wareham. Next. And out of those resilience scores, we also were able to create fact sheets for each of those sanctuaries with goals and benefits and restoration priorities. So these are 3 of the fact sheets from Allen's Pond, Rough Meadows, and Barnstable Great Marsh, respectively. Next. Another big part of this grant was to start a coastal resilience internship program, which was intended to engage underrepresented students from high school and college in salt marsh research. They were able to gain hands-on experience in scientific data collection. They were able to create presentations for a research symposium, and generally it provided them with professional development opportunities. Next. And here is an example of a poster that was created by 2 of the students for a local conference, looking at the climate vulnerability of Rough Meadows, which is within the Great Marsh, and comparing it to some of the other marshes. So this is just an example of the kind of work that we were able to help these students create. Next. Another component of the grant was to engage with the municipalities where these sanctuaries were present and to try to provide relevant training and planning support through 1 workshop per community to progress these adaptation initiatives. At this point, 2 of these workshops have been held. 1 was held in Barnstable with a focus on ditch remediation in salt marshes, where multiple salt marsh experts and municipal staff and other organizations from around Cape Cod, where Barnstable is located, were able to gather, learn about salt marsh restoration, and then go on a field trip out into the marsh to observe the impacts of various salt marsh stressors firsthand. The second workshop was held in Newburyport at our Joppa Flats sanctuary, which is not far from Rough Meadows, and we were able to focus on the marsh at Joppa Flats there. The Dartmouth and Wareham workshops are coming up in 2025, and we are hoping to dovetail those 2 workshops in tandem with some workshops that my colleagues are going to be doing through a Southern New England program grant through EPA. Next. So as an outcome of these restoration and vulnerability assessments, we actually have been able to begin restoration at some of these sanctuaries. So my colleagues at Mass Audubon and Conservation Science and in the Southeast region of Mass Audubon have been working very hard to restore the marsh at Allen's Pond. They have dug runnels to drain the pools on the surface of the marsh, which restores vegetation and stops marsh subsidence. They were able to remove stone walls that were in the marsh and allow for more marsh migration. They managed vegetation at Ocean View Farm, which is a farm that is upstream as far as sea level rise is concerned from the salt marsh, and also remove Phragmites to help facilitate marsh migration and improve habitat quality. Next. Restoration work has also been conducted at the Great Neck Sanctuary in Wareham. One of the parts of that was to remove an old area that was completely covered with asphalt that created diamondback terrapin habitat. The diamondback terrapin lives in the salt marsh, and this is just upstream or up gradient from the marsh. And then also, again, at this site, there was intensive Phragmites management to improve marsh habitat and marsh migration. Next. We have restoration upcoming at the other two sanctuaries that we're focused on in this grant. We are looking at doing restoration work at Barnstable Great Marsh, which is on the left, and Rough Meadows, which is on the right. And all of those little lines show places where ditches are going to be remediated, which will help the marsh not overdrain, and also places where runnels will be dug in the surface of the marsh to help drain pools and help reduce oversaturation and increase the growth of vegetation and reduce subsidence. Next. The great thing about this grant is that it connects very well to both statewide and Mass Audubon initiatives. So the state of Massachusetts has a program called the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, and that enrolls towns in the process of creating a vulnerability plan, and then they can apply for funding from the state to implement their resilience projects. And a newer initiative by the state is the Resilient Coasts Initiative, which is dividing our coastline into coastal resilience districts and looking at the best approaches to improve resilience in those different parts of the state. Because as I mentioned, the different parts of the state have different coastal needs as far as both the tidal range, but also in terms of urbanization and the kinds of populations that live in them. Mass Audubon also currently has a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grant program to focus on the environmental justice communities in Barnstable, Dennis, and Eastham on Cape Cod, and to try to develop a project in each of those communities that focuses on salt marsh restoration, while also engaging the community in the process of approaching their own restoration projects in those towns. Next. So I would like to thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was an amazing presentation. Looking forward to the questions we've got so far. So our next presentation and project is funded by the California Nevada Adaptation Program, or CNAP, which is a CAP team. And Tom will share quick overviews of two projects, actually, related to increasing adaptive coastal capacity through nature-based solutions. And Dr. Tom Corringham is an economist at Scripps Institution of Oceanographic, I cannot talk today, Oceanography, and the University of California, San Diego, focus on quantifying the social, economic, and equity impacts of extreme weather and climate change. Corringham's research considers the health impacts of wildfire smoke, flood and transportation impacts of atmospheric rivers, the role of insurance in addressing coastal storms and sea level rise, and the responses of agricultural communities to drought and sustainable groundwater regulations. Corringham also develops climate curriculum and climate workforce readiness programs. And I'll remind everyone once again that questions can be submitted for Tom and Sarah to answer. And Tom, take it away. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Aaliyah. Thanks to the NOAA team for the invitation, and also thanks, Sarah, for a great presentation. Great to be with you all today. So as Aaliyah mentioned, I'll be presenting on two projects that we are working on at CNAP, the California Nevada Adaptation Program. The first is joint with Laura Engemann, who is a colleague of mine at Scripps Institution of Oceanography and also at California Sea Grant. Next slide, please. So this first project looks at dunes as nature-based solutions to enhance the resilience of California's beaches to climate change. Next slide. So as many of you may know, coastal dunes act as a natural barrier against flooding and erosion and help mitigate the impacts of climate change and sea level rise. They can be culturally important landscapes, and they can serve as a habitat for threatened and endangered species. However, there are still many unknowns. It's not clear what the current extents are, and less clear what the historic extents are of these dune systems. It's unclear how vulnerable they are and how resilient they may be to sea level rise. We don't fully understand the rates of loss, the current rates of loss, and scientifically informed restoration is limited. Next slide, please. Here are some of the dune systems in California. From left to right is north to south. So on the left, we see dune systems around Eureka and Arcata in Northern California. The image is of the Lamphere and Malel dunes. Moving south, between Santa Cruz and Monterey, there are extensive dune systems. The picture below is of the Aeolian Dunes Preserve. In the central coast, between San Luis Obispo and Point Conception, again, extensive dune systems. The picture here is of the Guadalupe Nipomo dunes, which is just south of Morro Bay. And in Southern California, less in the way of dune systems, but there are some. I find it interesting that the photo on the lower right here is the only one that includes a parking lot. That's not uncommon for California dunes, given the level of Southern California dunes, given the level of development in Southern California. Next slide, please. So our project objectives are to create a statewide inventory of historic and contemporary coastal dunes. This is to be complete in this coming January. To conduct a vulnerability assessment of coastal dunes. This is in progress. Assess responses of restored dunes using field observations from 29 sites, and develop restoration frameworks for statewide guidance on protective dunes as nature-based solutions for sea level rise adaptation. Next slide, please. The first element of this is a dune vulnerability assessment, and this involves testing indicators of recent storm responses and dune change at specific sites. So this involves understanding elevation and vegetation line in dune systems, monitoring the different dune features, including toe height and location of the crest height and location of dune extent, which then allows us to estimate the volume, the vulnerability, and the vegetation cover of the dunes. In the second part of the assessment, we assess the vulnerability to future sea level rise, and we do this using sea level rise projections, our estimates of dune extent and elevation, and use this to understand and estimate future vulnerability. Next slide, please. One interesting element of our program has been that we have been organizing a set of Indigenous coastal reconnection workshops. So in California, you may think of when you think of tribal lands, you might think of the lands that are inland in the foothills or mountain areas or desert areas, but Indigenous lands historically include the coastal lands. So it's only in the last 250 years that tribes have been forcibly removed from the coastal zones. So we've been holding a series of workshops hosted by Indigenous and tribal leaders with presentations and discussions of coastal restoration, including dunes and wetlands. Participants have discussed the Indigenous history in these spaces and their priorities for stewardship, access, and leadership in coastal ancestral lands. And we have listed here a number of the different work groups that we've hosted in San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, and Orange County. And these workshops have been supported by the Climate Science Alliance, by California Sea Grant, and by CNAP. Next slide, please. So as I transition to the second project, I just wanted to discuss the concept of dynamic adaptive policy pathways. So this holds true for dune restoration projects. This holds true for many coastal resilience projects. And the project I'll be discussing next is of an ecotone levee. So the idea of dynamic adaptive policy pathways applies to both green infrastructure and gray infrastructure. On the left, you see a number of sea level rise projections put together by the Ocean Protection Council. And you can see that by 2150, we expect sea level to rise by 1 to 13 feet. So it's a wide range, but the best estimates are between 2 and 6 feet. This is for California. There are a number of strategies. We can protect, which is to prioritize existing alignment and uses through engineered efforts that may limit access, uses, or habitats. We can accommodate through minor retrofitting of existing built structures. So for example, we could increase the elevation of residential structures. This would focus on repair and maintenance as the impacts are realized, and the level or use of service may need to be adjusted as the status of assets change. And by assets, we mean homes, for example, businesses, roadways, parking lots, parklands. A more extreme response would be to relocate. So this would be to realign or relocate assets out of hazard areas and limit new development in these areas. And finally, we could take a hybrid approach, and these hybrid approaches may vary over time. So that we may be looking at a phased adaptation approach to balance social, environmental, and economic needs in our resilience projects. Next slide, please. The second project I wanted to discuss is just starting now. It is also funded by CNAP and by the California Department of Insurance and the Ocean Protection Council. This looks at climate insurance, sea level rise, and nature-based solutions in Imperial Beach, California. And this is joint with Denali Pinto, a former student of mine. Next slide. Imperial Beach is a coastal community in southwest San Diego County that borders Mexico and has water on 3 sides. On the north, Imperial Beach is bounded by San Diego Bay and the Otay River floodplain. On the west, it is bounded by the Pacific Ocean, and on the south, it is bounded by the Tijuana River estuary. So Imperial Beach is at risk of flooding on 3 sides during storm events. It also experiences blue sky flooding during king tides on the Pacific side. And we expect to see significant increases in flood risk under a range of sea level rise projections. One proposed solution is the creation of a bayshore bikeway ecotone levee on the north side of the city. Next slide, please. So here we see the bayshore neighborhood of Imperial Beach, and the light blue area is the area that is flooded already during storm events. The teal color is the area that will be flooded, that we expect to be flooded with 3 feet of sea level rise during extreme storm conditions. And then the darker blue is what we would expect to be flooded under 6 feet of sea level rise. So you can see there are 2 areas there within the Bayshore neighborhood, including the Bayside Elementary School, that would be flooded under sea level rise projections. And I just want to draw your attention to the black line that that moves along that is along the north side of the community. This is the location of the proposed ecotone levee and enhancement of the existing Bayshore bikeway. Next slide. So we're going to try this. I have a video. So if you could try running the video, please. It should be on the next slide. There it is. Okay, we're moving very fast here. This is at 4 times the normal cycling speed. But you can see here we're moving counterclockwise from west to east. On the right is the community of Imperial Beach. On the left is San Diego Bay, the wetlands. And you can see that it's very low elevation. So during storm events, the community on the right here experiences flooding. On the right, as we approach here, is the elementary school. And now as we're reaching the east side of the community, it's slightly higher elevation, so at slightly less risk of flooding. But one thing I will emphasize here is that the community is interesting as it is on the border of Mexico and at the Tijuana River estuary. And the Tijuana River is highly polluted as the watershed extends into Tijuana. And as a result, the coastline at Imperial Beach is also relatively polluted. Next slide, please. And so the income level, the property prices are lower and the income level in the community is lower. It's one of few coastal communities in California that is a relatively low income community. Most of the residents are renters and they do not have flood insurance. So I mentioned that this project, looking at the construction of the Bayshore Bikeway and the Ecotone Levee, is partly funded by the Department of Insurance in California. We're looking at a couple of different insurance issues. On the one hand, and this is common for many nature-based solutions, if the city of Imperial Beach does nothing, then it does not assume any liability for flooding that occurs along the north end of the community. If it were to go ahead with this Ecotone Levee and flooding were to occur, it would be assuming some liability. So this is often a barrier to pursuing nature-based solutions for coastal resilience projects. So one solution would be an indemnity insurance product to insure the nature-based solution itself. So if there were under seepage or overtopping or a failure of the levee, then the city of Imperial Beach and other agencies that might be responsible would be insured against losses. Another issue, as I mentioned, low-income renters of Imperial Beach do not have flood insurance. Flooding causes compounding negative impacts in the community, so one potential solution would be a so-called parametric insurance product that would provide immediate payouts to renters in the event of a flood. Next slide, please. So the project objectives are to quantify the protection gap, identify existing sources of coverage, and develop and hopefully implement these novel climate insurance products. Next slide. So the first thing we've done is map out all of the properties in the neighborhood and look at how the amount of damage to each property would vary with the depth of flooding, and then link that through to the sea level rise projections. Next slide, please. From this, our preliminary estimates indicate that exposure is expected to increase fourfold with 50 centimeters of sea level rise, and the average annual loss, or AAL, is also expected to increase fourfold with 50 centimeters of sea level rise and increase 16-fold with 2 meters of sea level rise. And very few of these structures are currently protected, but they would be fully protected under the construction of the Ecotone Levee. Next slide. We're working closely with the insurance industry. There's a lot of interest from the industry. There are existing projects looking at insurance for natural infrastructure. So looking at coral reefs in Florida and Hawaii. This is a project with the Nature Conservancy and the Bank of America. The Nature Conservancy and Swiss Re have developed parametric insurance products to protect reefs in Quintana Roo in Mexico. And the large insurer Marsh McLennan has been working on community-based catastrophe insurance. And I'll just mention parametric insurance. So traditional indemnity insurance, there's a loss, you go to the adjuster, you show what the loss is, and after several months, you receive the payout. Parametric insurance provides an automatic payout when some triggering event happens. So wind speed over some threshold or precipitation over some threshold. And the idea is that if there were flooding, for example, in Imperial Beach, the renters could receive an immediate payout. The city would likely be the holder of the insurance policies. But there is a lot of interest from the insurance industry, and that's what we'll be working on in this project. Last slide, please. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and my email is tomc@ucsd.edu. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Tom. We really appreciate you taking the time to share both those projects. I'm going to shift over to Bhaskar to help moderate our question and answers, and folks, you all can continue to submit questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaliyah. Tom and Sarah, both of you, amazing presentation, very informative. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm actually seeing the comments and the questions on here. A lot of people are actually appreciating it. I'm sure you're actually seeing the virtual the clap. let's actually get started with the Q&A session. And since Sarah, you presented first, I wanted to put this question out to you. One of the audience member asked, what is the process like for developing the restoration plan for 2 locations that you've actually showed? Sarah?
The process. Well, our process starts with investigating the site, doing some historical research and finding out what kinds of historical stressors may have existed on the landscape, doing vegetation surveys, assessing what the impacts that have already occurred to the marsh, and then we're still relatively on the forefront of how we design these kinds of projects. So um, a lot of it goes toward just balancing the hydrology of the marsh and determining which techniques will help restore vegetation and elevation the best. And it depends on which marsh you're located in, which ones work best.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Tom, I have a question for you. Your example about the Imperial Beach was something that I thought was very, very interesting. One of the audience members' question was, would the levee at the Imperial Beach act or have similar characteristics as a dune system?
So yes, in some ways, the Ecotone levee includes natural habitat restoration, and in a sense, it is providing the same elevation gain that a dune system provides. This one is sort of a back bay ecosystem as opposed to a coastal ecosystem. So that's a slight difference there. But there are the same, many of the same considerations apply in terms of habitat restoration, elevation, and protection of coastal assets.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Um, Sarah, here's another question for you, and I think this is a very, very good question. Um, the question is, have there been any challenges in achieving community buy-in for NBS versus the conventional approaches in your experience? And in your engagement community engagement, what technique do you think was most effective?
Well, I think probably the biggest issue, I suppose, that we face is that there are a whole host of coastal impacts from sea level rise, from storm damage. We have these nor'easters that hit these coastal storms. We're potentially vulnerable to hurricanes as well. We've been very lucky, knock on wood. But in a community's assessment of the kinds of things that they would like to do, often other priorities, some of the things like that Tom talked about, can sometimes rise to the top over what seem like maybe lower priorities, like restoring marshes. So we've been lucky in that a lot of the communities do see the value in these natural landscapes, but often a lot of the focus does get shifted to infrastructure issues, property issues, emergency access issues. So I would say it's really elevating restoration work, coastal restoration work, nature-based solutions to the same level as what feel sometimes like more urgent concerns.
And regarding the second part of the question, regarding the community engagement piece of it, what was one that was very, very effective in your experience?
What has been effective has been going to the communities themselves. I mean, Massachusetts is very town based. We don't have a strong county government. So every town by town, going and talking to town staff, going and sitting in their offices, asking them what they're concerned about. And the piece that we're really trying to work on more is how to reach the broad spectrum of the community, because again, the inequities in the communities often mean that the voices that get heard more often are not those that are exposed to as much damage,
Right.
often the environmental justice communities. So we are working actively on strategies to try to get into those communities. Um, a great approach is to not assume that the community is going to come to you, but to actually go to the community where people are and listen. Listening is the most important part.
Awesome. Along the same line, Tom, here's a question for you. You mentioned in your presentation about the Indigenous Coastal Reconnection Workshop that you held as part of the first project. How did the outcomes from that workshop inform the project, and how did you hold on one second, I'm going to see it. How did you actually protect the data sovereignty of the indigenous knowledge share? I can repeat those questions if you want me to.
No, I got it. Thank you. Thank you, Bhaskar. Yeah, just to chime in with Sarah's points here, and I think to answer this question as well, if it's possible to link the nature-based solution to other amenities, then it's easier to get buy-in from the community. So in the case of the Bayshore Bikeway, there's a bike path. There's also restoration of the elementary school playground to create a detention basin. So these other amenities are really appealing to the community. And I can think of, for many green infrastructure projects for coastal restoration, there are obvious tie-ins to amenity, including improved access to coastal resources, potential park space or habitat restoration. So these are important. And then on community engagement, I would say meeting early and often, and being very deliberate about the inclusivity of these meetings. So with the tribal engagement piece, we went directly to the tribes. Luckily, we were partnering with trusted partners of the tribe, so we weren't going in and having to build new relationships from scratch. We were working with the Climate Science Alliance, who have been working with the tribes in Southern California for some time. And in terms of data sovereignty, I'm not really expert on that issue, but I understand that we were following best practices there. And about the workshops, I think there was a lot of interest there and excitement around bringing the tribes to the table on both sides, to reconnect with these ancestral lands. And as I said, we don't usually think of coastal lands being tribal in California, with a couple of exceptions in Northern California, but historically they are very much a part of the tribal history.
As a community itself, we're trying to actually see how do we actually fast track trust, right? I mean, how do we actually make our community that we are serving trust us quickly than it is. So thank you so much, Tom, for that answer. Moving on to Sarah, the restoration piece of it, the question that I see here is, were there any plans for monitoring and evaluation to look at the efficacy of the proposed restoration work at these sites? Were there something that was actually designed and from the get-go?
I mean, most of our projects incorporate pre-implementation as well as post-restoration monitoring. So right now, actually, the state of Massachusetts is working to develop salt marsh monitoring metrics that will dovetail with our permitting. We have a pretty complicated permitting in the state of Massachusetts. It's a blessing and a curse, I suppose, because we have a very, very strong Wetlands Protection Act in the state. But that means that when you go to do restoration, you have to be thinking about how restoration is impacting those wetlands and how it looks and according to the letter of the law. So there are a lot of pieces that we are still trying to tease out, but there is a state working group that I am on, where we will be looking at what those metrics will be to evaluate the success of the restoration. But broadly, much of it is based in vegetation returning, in particular high marsh vegetation, which provides habitat for salt marsh sparrow, and the return of those salt marsh sparrows as well after the Allen's Pond restoration. I unfortunately don't have the actual numbers, but it's one of the strongest salt marsh sparrow populations, definitely in the state, maybe even in the Northeast. So,
And just to give a
great
context,
success.
it is a threatened and endangered species, right?
Yes, 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 yes. And it builds its nests on the salt marsh grasses. So as sea level rises, the nests are vulnerable. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Sarah. Tom, here's a question for you, this is a question again about Imperial Beach, and this is about insurance. If the city of Imperial Beach holds the insurance policy and the parametric payments to homeowners, who pays the premium?
Right. This is this is the key question, I think, for all of these products. So in pilot projects, we typically have, the insurance policies are grant funded. So we have grants that cover the premium payments. I gave an example of the coral reef insurance that was organized by the Nature Conservancy and backed by Swiss Re. In that in that system, the premiums were paid by local governments, but also by the tourism industry, all of whom benefit from healthy reefs. So in that case, if the atmospheric pressure dropped below a certain threshold, indicating a hurricane, there was a payout to the local communities. They were able to go in and restore the reef. In the case of Imperial Beach, long term, we think that there may be a case to be made for having the city itself hold the policies, just because of these cascading impacts of harm to the renters in the community. So if they're unable to work or send their kids to school, or they have to stay in a hotel, they don't have access to their kitchens, then this has spiraling and cascading impacts on the community as a whole. So it may be in the interest of the city to cover those premium costs, but it's an open question. That's always the difficult question with these products, is who is willing to pay long term.
And it gets always sticky, right? Thank you so much. So Sarah, I have a question here. So regarding the marsh restoration project, did you take measurements to assess any impacts of soil or blue carbon content or changes in greenhouse gas emissions, in the project that you did?
So I will say that my predecessor, Danielle Perry, who now works for NOAA, and who started this project, is a blue carbon in marshes expert. And I don't know as much about blue carbon in marshes.
Okay.
Some of the recent research that I have read has been saying that restored marshes are not as great at sequestering carbon as a natural marsh. Um, but we are hoping to be able to bring the marsh's capability to sequester carbon as close to natural as possible.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I know we are almost at the end of the session. So I have a question for both of you, if you don't mind. So the question is, in addition to climate change impacts, other stressors are contributing to adverse effect on the environment. Are there any examples of community-based actions to address some of these stressors? Second thing is, how is capacity building wrapped into the process of community engagement so that the community within and around these resources thrive in building resiliency? Whoever wants to take the question first.
I can answer the first part of the
Sure.
question, at least. So my favorite community action that can be taken by your standard coastal citizen around New England is reducing nutrient inputs to the marshes and estuaries. There's a clear connection between increased nutrients and increased subsidence of salt marshes, which just makes them more vulnerable to sea level rise. So, if you are a homeowner, or even if you're living inland, that impervious surface is going to lead that those nutrients from your lawn into a marsh potentially. So, keeping that in mind, you can help your marsh by not using too much fertilizer.
Awesome. Tom, if you want to answer, just very briefly, see if you can address this. How do you suggest, building capacity in the process of community engagement? Any suggestions? Any ideas?
Sure. I think I'll just say that that is one of the critical elements, is that we do have to build that capacity over time. Any policy, that we can come up with, it all depends on the local community having the capacity to implement, and then long term, anything we can do to help local communities build the capacity to seek out grants and funding to finance these projects is critical.
Awesome. Once again, Sarah and Tom, thank you so much for your presentation and answering these questions really, really well. I'll turn it over to Leah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone. We can't say it enough. We will have our fourth webinar in December on the 17th from 3 to 4, and the focus will be utilizing nature-based solutions for the advancement of multiple objectives, co-benefits, and health. And as a reminder, this webinar was recorded and we'll be distributing it shortly. Thank you everyone, and I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving. Take care.